how do the divine attributes relate to the divine essence? Jacob says, the attributes cannot be separated from the nature. They are the nature, directed or determined in different ways and relations. As God cannot be comprehended, he reveals himself to finite man by leading man to various standpoints from which the simple and indivisible nature of God may be regarded. While God's nature is not the sum of his attributes, our knowledge of his nature is the sum of our knowledge of his attributes. Okay, so what's being said here? When we are talking about things that exist in creation, we can distinguish between the essence of something, the nature of that thing, and then the attributes that that thing has. And they're not always identical. So there are some attributes of things that are essential attributes, and there are some that are what we call accidental attributes. Accidental attributes are those attributes that don't define a thing, that could change while the thing retains its essence. So, for example, as I'm recording this, I'm sitting in front of a desk, and this is a nice wood mid-century desk in front of me, and it has, a certain kind of shape and construction and color. Now, there are certain elements of that desk that have to exist for me to call it a desk. And so it has to have like a flat surface that I can actually work on, because that's kind of the point of a desk. And if it doesn't have that flat surface that I can work on in any way, it's not really a desk. It doesn't function as a desk. It's something else. If I were to take this same material and, chop it all up and reshape it into something I could sit on, now I've taken the same material, the same wood, but I've made it something else. Its essence is something else. It's no longer a desk. It's now a chair, even though the matter is the same. The material is the same. But there are things that I could do to this desk that would retain its essence as a desk, but it would change certain attributes. And so I might, for some crazy reason, decide to paint over this nice walnut wood of this desk, paint it all bright red. Well, the color of the desk, which is an attribute of the desk, it's an accidental attribute, might change, but the essence remains the same. It's the same desk. It's just now red instead of walnut wood. So the color is something that could change. I could take off the pulls on the drawers. I could change those. So there are elements of a thing that are accidental, and then there are elements that are of its very nature. So things that it has to have, properties that it has to have. Okay, so essential properties, accidental properties. When we are speaking about God, he doesn't relate to his attributes in the way that things of this earth do. So I talked about a physical thing, which is a desk. Now, if we're talking about the nature of a living thing, like a human being, we also can be divided up into these kind of essential and non-essential attributes too. We can do that in a physical sense. So if you lose an arm in an accident, you're still the same person. So that's accidental to you, or it doesn't define who you are. Now, you may be a person who has less capabilities because of the accident, but that doesn't mean you're not a person. You might have other elements of yourself that are, less significant, like, the length of your hair. You might get a haircut, so whether your hair grows to some length or you cut, it's not really going to affect your nature, but it is an attribute of yourself that changes. We can even think of our location. Like as I'm talking, I'm moving my hands. So this is an attribute that is constantly changing. So my location is something that is accidental. It's not essential to who I am. I'm not no longer me if I'm standing outside. But then we can also speak about attributes of us that are personal ones, things that aren't so identifiable by physical things. And so we have personality traits. You might be really stubborn. That's an attribute of who you are. You're really stubborn. Or you might be very emotionally affected by things. Maybe you feel things on a deeper level than other people do. Maybe you are very hardened in your personality and you hardly have emotions at all. Those are attributes or elements of your personality. And those elements of your personality, though, can change, but still you can remain the same person. There might be things about your personality that are kind of negatives that you want to work on. Maybe you want to work on your stubbornness, and maybe you get over it to some degree. Well, you're still the same person. So the point is that we have a distinction that exists in us, in physical objects, in everything that we know of and we encounter in our experience. But there's a distinction between the essence of a thing, or what it is, and the attributes of that thing. With God, we don't have that same kind of distinction. There is no difference between God's essence and his attributes. And so God doesn't have any non-essential properties or attributes. But he also doesn't really have essential properties in the same way that we do, because there is an identification between his essence and his attributes, or who he is. Now, this is what we call divine simplicity. And so the idea of this is to say that God's essence is simple, meaning that it's not composite, right? Our essence, who we are, is composite. We are composed of various elements, elements that are physical, elements that are mental, elements that are just personality or affections. We're composed of all sorts of different stuff. God can't be composed of different things, because that would contradict his divinity. If, for example, God were made up of a number of different attributes that exist not just as his essence, but apart from him, so that God is holy, God is loving, God is good, God is powerful. See, these are separate attributes, and God is made up, or is a kind of bundle of those attributes all put together in his person. Well, what that would mean is that those attributes, since they make up God, are actually a more fundamental element of reality than God is, because he's composed of something outside of himself. And that can't be the case, because he would no longer be God. So to understand God as God, we have to understand that he is like the foundational element of reality, of existence. And so God can't be composite in the way that we are, in the way that created things are. So we call this divine simplicity. Now, that means that, as I said, in God himself, in terms of God's archetypal knowledge, his self-knowledge, God's attributes in essence are exactly identical. They're the same. But we don't have access to that knowledge, right? We don't have access to God's essential knowledge of himself. It's an impossibility. And so we don't know God in that way. We know God as having distinct attributes. But even though in the divine essence themselves they're not distinct, as they relate to us, we understand that God is distinct. And so that's why he says here that he reveals himself to finite man, so us, finite human beings, in various standpoints. So this is the nature of God, like the nature of God as he is in himself. As he relates to sin, we see that simple nature of God as a God who is wrathful, right? Because sin is a contradiction of God's nature. As we see God's nature displayed in the cross of Jesus Christ, we see God's love and God's glory. But what we're distinguishing is not something that is so distinct in the divine essence as if God has these competing parts of himself or something. Like God has justice here and he has love here, and they kind of got to battle it out. One's got to have victory over the other. And there are certain modern theologies that speak kind of in that way. But what we're saying is this is God's simple essence as it relates to things outside of himself. So as God's nature relates to sin, it looks very different from us than how God's nature relates to righteousness, or relates to one who's forgiven, or relates to one who is stubbornly refusing his forgiveness. So when we're talking about divine attributes as distinct, this is just to say that we understand that the distinction is not in God's own being, but in how he relates to us. And that's how we speak of God, right? We speak of God not so much as he is in himself and his simple essence. We don't have access to that. But we speak of him as he relates to us, in the creation of things outside of himself, in his acts of redemption, in his acts of love, in his word as he has revealed himself to us.